All right, we'll see if this works again now. I had to reset the program and we'll hopefully see. And Howard did some clarification on the interlining. According to the definition, it seems to be used for warmth of a garment, while interfacing is used to add shaping. So that's really good to know. Then I will use the word interfacing now because that's primarily what I'm going to talk about. Hopefully the computer will survive this, and as I said, I do have some technical glitches. It's a new computer and a new setup, so I probably need to figure that out until the next time. Anyways, so what I was talking about just when I disappeared was that fusible interfacing is probably the most common thing, and there are actually lots of different interfacing when it comes to fusible as well. What I'm holding in my hand now is a knit type of version, which has a crosswise stretch and it has sort of a knitted surface, so it stretches mostly in one direction but a little bit in the other direction as well. And I'm very, very fond of this because it has a very sort of flexible, soft hand, because sometimes, you know, interfacing can kind of mess up things and change the hand of the fabric. And what I really like about using the type of knit interfacing is that they don't really change the hand. And I have linked also to a blog post that I did when it comes to knit interfacing that you can check out, where I talk more about the different type of things. And there's also, of course, the woven fusible interfacing, and I would really like to know more about your experience with knit interfacing, if you the woven interfacing, because I have tried that a couple of times, but I'm not really fond of how it changes the fabric. So what's a woven fusible interfacing is, it's cotton fabric, and on one side it has glue on it, which kind of I find that it creates a rather stiff feeling, but I can see the use for, you know, where there's a big need for stability, such as in a waistband perhaps, and if you're doing like working with more heavy duty type of garments, or, you know, outerwear perhaps, then woven fusible would be better. But in my experience, or perhaps I've just gotten bad quality, I'm not overly impressed by the quality of it. So I would love to hear your thoughts about that, if you too have similar experience, and of course if you like to use woven fusible interfacing, how do you like it? So anyways, and when it comes to sewing interfacing, there are several different versions as well. So sewing interfacing is obviously when you stitch by hand, or you just attach it in the seam. And I don't use much, I should say, non-fusible interface, but one thing that I'm very, very fond of is to use, this is silk organza, and I use this for every time I make a sheer fabric, such as something in chiffon or soft silk, also cotton well, embroidered fabric, anything is a little bit see-through. I prefer to use either silk organza, or there's also an option which is called cotton organdy, which is also really great. Unfortunately, I don't have it right now. It's a little bit hard to track down in Sweden, but if you have any tips of any vendors internationally that sells this, I would love to know, because that's a really, really good thing to also have in your interfacing sort of collection, is to have some type of fabric. Because a great way to ruin the fabric is, I personally think, is to use too much fusible on delicate fabrics. I'm sure it can work, but I haven't quite been as successful with that. Perhaps it's a technical thing and I need to improve my pressing techniques, but I do find personally that I prefer to use this type of interfacing rather than using fusible for any type of delicate fabrics. And Duncan says woven is often disappointing. Well, it's not that great. It sounds great in theory, but I don't think it's all that great. Anyways, another, obviously, a really common way to use sewing interfacing is when you're doing tailoring, which is obviously any type of like hair canvas, or you know, how should I put it? I think it's horsehair, and different type of linen canvas. There are lots of different qualities, obviously, when you're doing tailoring. And I have not much experience with that, apart from the fact that I participated in a tailoring workshop, just a brief one, where I was shown how to attach the hair canvas to the suiting fabric, you know, doing stitching. I have not used it in one of my own garments. When I did a tailor jacket earlier this year, I actually used what is usually a thing to refer to as speed tailoring, which means that you're using fusible interfacing to create tailoring, which I think is probably getting more and more common, obviously, because it's perhaps more time saving. But I will say though, because you have to be delicate with pressing, and if you don't have like this big pressing board, fusing and an entire jacket front with a tiny iron, that takes a lot of time. So I'm not 100% sure that it saves all that time, because I literally spent several hours pressing the fusible interface into my tailor jacket. So that was not a quick method. It wasn't speedy in my opinion anyways. And obviously there are lots of other types of interfacing as well that you can use. For instance, if you look at any type of, if you're doing embroidery, machine embroidery, I think in particular, there's always some type of interfacing on the back of the fabric to give it stability. I'm not really familiar with good brands when it comes to that. So if you do machine embroidery, any type of embroidery, I'd love to know if you have any suggestions on what to look for when you're doing embroidery, interfacing and things like that, because that's not really my speciality, although I would love to get one of those embroidery machines, but they're a bit expensive, so that's not really in the cards for me. So it looks like I have some connection problem here, and if you could please tell me if you notice if I'm back online again, because it looks fine on my end this time, but it's really hard to say if it works or not. So please tell me in the chat. Oh, thank you. Excellent. Oh, anyways, there's a lot of things going on tonight. Obviously, I'm sorry for all the technical mishaps, but that's definitely one of those things that happens when you're trying to do this live. So another thing I'm really curious about, if you know more about, is if sometimes it's recommended to pre-shrink fusible interfacing. Now, the brand that I most commonly use in Sweden doesn't state that you need to pre-shrink it, so I'm really curious to know if you have an experience with that, and also what is a good method to pre-shrink fusible interfacing. Do you soak it in water? And how do you know if you need to do it or not? Because I'm really curious about that, because that's not an area that I have sort of looked into, but I know that it could be a good idea, since obviously one of the problems you can encounter when you're applying fusible is that after washing, the fusible and the fabric will not gel, so you get like wrinkles and bubbly things. So I'm really curious if pre-shrinking is something we should do more often. So that's something I'm really curious about. As I said, I've not really tried it again, which brings me to basically how to apply interfacing, which is I'm trying to watch the internet now, because I'm also trying to keep an eye on the technical stuff. So that's why I'm a little bit scattered tonight, but I will hopefully try to be as cohesive as possible. I definitely feel like, will this go down again? Who knows? But then again, it's live, so everything can happen. And Howard says he has never pre-shrunk fusible interfacing and never had any problems. So maybe it's not that common. As I use the brand Flisseline, or I think sometimes called Freudenberg. I think Freudenberg might be the company, and Flisseline is the brand name for fusible interfacing. So I know that this is definitely not something that is available all over the world. So I would love if you can tell me in the chat what are your favorite brands for fusible interfacing, because one of the things that I definitely want to stress is that there can be a pretty huge difference between bad quality fusible interfacing and good quality fusible interfacing, and the Flisseline Freudenberg brand does cost a little bit more than the no brand interfacing in Sweden, but if I can, I always try to make sure that I buy that brand, because I've had some really awful experience when it comes to those cheap interfacing. So please share in the chat section. I will read them up. Your recommendation for great brands, and I heard there could be some Black Friday deals as well. So that might be a good chance now to stock it up before that sale ends. And Mado says Flisseline is the only brand here as well. I wonder how it's in North America, because I suspect there are a lot of other brands there instead. The Flisseline is a German brand, and if you do a lot of Burda patterns or read the Burda magazine, you'll see that they always recommend Flisseline, to the point where I suspect that they actually might have some brand deal with them, because they don't say interfacing, they say the specific Flisseline brand number, so what type of a specific interfacing, and sometimes there is even a page dedicated to the different Flisseline interfacing. So it's German company, so maybe that's the story. Pellon in the US, that's a good to know. I think Pellon, that's not a brand that I think is available in Europe. Sometimes I also think that you will probably end up getting kind of the same products, but with different brand names. I suspect that could be the case. And Deborah has some more thoughts about the pre-shrinking. I think how one could go about pre-shrinking fusible. The instruction never mentioned. I'm interested in some brand suggestions as well. From my understanding, is that you can soak it in cold water, and obviously it needs to be cold so it doesn't activate the glue, and then you let it dry. And then it's pre-shrunk, but don't quote me on that. But I think that's how you do it. And obviously, as most of us, it doesn't really seem to do all that difference. And speaking of Howard also says Pellon, by the way. So Pellon is probably one of the brands to check out if you want to up your fusible game, and if you're in Europe, definitely stick with the Flisseline brand. One of the things I've done so many mistakes when it comes to interfacing. Now, the biggest mistake I think is that I, for a long time, didn't use it enough. I could end up, doing shirt collars without using interfacing. I tried to skip it on plackets, cuffs on shirts. I mean, now I feel stupid just mentioning it, but I think it's quite common if you don't get the proper introduction to sewing. There are a lot of things that it's easy to skip and not really understand how valuable they are. But once you start using fusible interfacing, I think it's really common, and I'm definitely one of those people who've done that, is to make mistakes when pressing it. So I'm going to go through the best practices. Some of these I have not followed myself many times with disastrous results. So I can definitely vouch that this is the best method to ensure that the fusible is evenly pressed and sticks to the fabric. And also, Kyle also has another point here about the brand tips before I talk about the method. And Kyle says, I buy interfacing from fashionsewingsupply.com in the US. The interfacing is really wide. That's great. And really good. It comes in different colors, natural white or black, and in light and medium weights. Yeah, because that's pretty much all I would say you need for your sort of basic interfacing wardrobe, is to have black and white, light and medium, because that's really, really, really versatile. I will talk about other thickness later on, but that's definitely the basics of it. And Pellon is quite pricey apparently, so I suspect it's probably the similar model to the Flisseline. And I'm not saying that you can't get excellent interfacing for cheaper prices, but the problem is that it's definitely something you need to make sure that it's from a seller that is reliable, because I think you take a bigger risk if you're skipping the no brands. But I've definitely bought no names interfacing that was really good. So it's just that it's a little bit of a lottery compared to sticking to the brands. And anyway, so now I'm going to go through all the steps that comes how to apply interfacing. And just like with most things when it comes to sewing, always do a sample test first to see if your chosen interfacing will like the fabric, because there are definitely different type of situation that can happen. And so it's really good that you just cut a little bit of the piece of interfacing and you attach it and then you test it. And I also sometimes, if I'm really worried, I also like to soak it in water just to make sure that everything looks great after washed as well. So I'm going to go through all the steps now. So you have to imagine this is an imaginary ironing board, because I do have one in the back here, but it will be a bit too complicated to go back and show you. But what I do, and I think it's the best method that I found. I sometimes skip all the steps, but I think this is like the best practice. And obviously first, you place the fusible on the wrong side of the fabric, and then depending on what the fusible says, some should not use moist, but most will set better if you place a damp cloth between the interfacing and the iron. So for best results, I do find that a damp cloth is the best method. But as I said, it can a little bit depend on what sort of fusible you're doing. But for most part, that is much better in my opinion than perhaps using steam for the iron, because that can result in a bubbly fabric. So a little bit more risky. So damp cloth I recommend for the safest bet when it comes to interfacing. And usually it will say on the packet where you bought it if you should use the lowest setting, which is silk. On irons here in Europe at least there's 1 dot, and wool, which is 2 dots, was a little bit warmer. So it can depend. I find that most fleece linen fusible is on the wool setting. So if your fabric can handle it and the fusible can handle it, I definitely recommend it to go for the wool setting. And the most important thing here is when you start pressing, and this is, I've actually had a friend who's a tailor correcting me on this when I was doing a sewing meetup a couple of years ago. So I still make this mistake sometimes when I'm a little bit stressed, and that is you should never ever sort of move the iron back and forth, right? Because you have to press. You have to press, and you need to keep that iron for, it depends, but perhaps like between 10 and 20 seconds to make sure that the glue sticks to the fabric. And it's so tempting to move the iron back and forth, but that can definitely mess up things. So I'm sure you don't do that mistake, but I am definitely been guilty of it many times over, I'm afraid. And then you move the iron, press the nest surface, and move the iron and press the nest surface. And of course, if the damp cloth is starting to dry up, you just give it a quick soak again, squeeze out the moisture, put the cloth on again, and keep on pressing. So that's what I think is the best method. And once I'm done, I usually like to flip the fabric over and actually press it on the right side of the fabric as well, just to make sure that it evens out and that I'm imagining that I help, both even it out and also set it a little bit from the other side. Now, the next point, I'm really curious to know what you have heard and what is your experience, and that is whether or not fusible interfacing has a set time. Because I was taught many years ago from a man who has like a long background in the sewing industry. He said that he actually recommend that after you pressed, you actually let the pressed fabric rest overnight before you start filling with it. Now, I have not seen that sort of recommendation in the usual instructions for the interfacing, so maybe he was exaggerating, but my personal belief is that I think it's good to let it set for a bit. So don't start filling with the fusible straight away. Just let it cool and make sure that the glue sticks to the fabric. I have no scientific evidence for this, but I do trust this man, and it does make sense to me. But obviously overnight, that sounds a bit overkill, to be honest. But so I would love to hear what your experience is and what you've heard about this setting time. And so Howard says that I let the fabric cool before I handle it too much. So perhaps just make sure that it's cool enough. That's probably all that is required. And Deborah says, overnight, really? I want to get on with it, lol. Yeah, I think that was a bit of an exaggerating, but that's what he said. So maybe he was just trying to make a point that you shouldn't start filling with the fabric straight away. And Mira says, I've heard that too. They don't overnight, but till it cools, certainly depends on the fabric, yeah. And Duncan says, leave it to cool for a few minutes. Overnight is excessive. So I think we can put that advice to rest. You don't need to put it overnight, but definitely let it cool properly. So, do a little thing, do some other things in the meantime if you get a bit antsy when it comes to your sewing lust there. But I do think it's important to cool it at least. And when it comes to fusible interfacing, most of us has encountered some problems. So I'm going to run through a few of the most sort of common things that can happen and suggestions for how to avoid it. Usually the solution boils down to pretty much a similar advice, regardless of what type of problems you encounter, but it's good to run through them as well. One of the common things that can happen is that when you are fusing, you will notice that on the right side of the fabric there will be some wrinkles or bubbly surface, and that is not good news. And there's usually a combination of things, but one is obviously that you used too much heat, which caused the interfacing to react, and that in following causes the creases or the bubbles. Or another problem is, of course, that you perhaps let it press for too long. So just doing, over the recommended, say, 15-20 seconds won't result in better fusing. So there's definitely a cutoff point there, and it's good to avoid that. I use the timer on my cell phone now, actually, to make sure that I've done the correct time. I'm not sure how important it is on the second, but I definitely think you should keep your eye on the time and not sort of hacking it, because it can definitely make a big difference. And another thing is that can cause this bubble is if you have too much moist, or you going crazy with the steaming on the iron. I think in general you shouldn't use steam when you're doing fusible. I think it's better with a damp cloth. I think it can work, but you have to be very, very conservative with the steam, because it's the heat that you need is the focus, and the problem with steam is that it's an uneven distribution of moisture compared to a damp cloth. And so that's usually the most common things when it comes to the interfacing. So you definitely need to be careful both with the heat and the setting time and the moist to avoid that bubbly shrinkly thing. And again, it comes down to also making a sample first to make sure that the fusible will react well with the fabric that you picked. And another thing that can happen is that you end up, feeling that the hand of the fabric changes too much when you're using fusible. And again, it can be caused by the fact that you sort of overfused it, and it has sort of created this hard glued surface that can sort of affect how the fabric feels as well. And obviously you can also be caused by the fact you use the wrong type of fusible. And speaking of that, I think that for the most part you should be quite restrictive going for those super firm interfacing. In fact, I find that this is the lightweight version. It's sometimes called blouse weight. I find that using that and the mid-weight fusible, it works for pretty much anything. I use it for waistband as well, because one of the mistakes when I began sewing was that I used those dedicated paper stiff fusible for waistband, and that was not a pleasant experience to wear on the body, because it became super firm. And I can see why it was like that, because obviously back in the days the fashion was a bit more restrictive, but in today modern times, when we have a lot of expectations of comfort and stuff, we don't want those tight rigid waistbands. So I actually use medium weight fusible for my waistband, and obviously since we use a lot of stretch fabrics these days, which is another case for not going crazy with the stiff fusible for waistband. So that's one of my pet peeves and one of the mistakes I've done myself. And so that's also good to know. You don't really need to have like a wide variety of interfacing. As Kyle said, you know, black and white, medium and light, that rhymes. But does it? Will last a long way for the most part. So it's not like you have to. And also, as I said, I'm a big fan of the sort of knit interfacing. I also use that for waistband as well sometimes, the a bit firmer knit fusible, because I really like how well it shapes the body, especially when you're doing waistband using stretch fabrics, which many of us does these days. I mean, I definitely sense that the non-stretch fabric are sort of moving away, especially when it comes to trouser making. Now, you know, even fine suiting can have like fine designer wool suiting can have a little addition of lycra to it sometimes, which I find it really fascinating. So that definitely reflects a bit how we wear our clothes today and the sort of expectations we have on that. And Deborah also has some more thoughts about the use of setting the fusible. She says, you know, come to think about it, I do all the interfacing first, so it probably does sit overnight by the time I get to it, but I never just wait on purpose. So yeah, I try to do the same. Sometimes also I get so exhausted by interfacing fusibles that I'm done for the night. So as just like you, Deborah, it's something that comes and sort of goes. So I usually will not work too much with with the fabric, because I find the process of interfacing so exhausting. Which brings me to another tip. I wonder if you do that as well. Sometimes if you're doing you want to make it a little bit easier, is that if you're doing a lot of pieces using the same type of interfacing, is actually to interface a larger chunk of fabric at the same time. So, and then you place the pattern pieces on top of that. So you cut the fused fabric. That saves time. And also, if you're working with slightly slippery fabrics, adding the fusible first will make the cutting much easier. So if you can live with a little bit of waste, because sometimes you won't be able to reuse the rest of the fused fabric, obviously, but then again, perhaps you won't be able to use the scraps anyway, and of course you might have to spend a little more interfacing that way, because you have to toss it away. So perhaps it's not as sustainable when I think about it, but it's definitely something that makes it easier. So I do that sometimes just because I find it, you know, it just makes cutting so much easier. And Kyle says, yes, that's my favorite. Block fuse, then cut out the pieces. So if you don't do that, please try. And obviously, if you have one of those wonderful pressing stations, you know, when I like a flatbed, that I would assume makes block fusing a dream. But it can be done with a regular iron as well, trust me, even though I actually, as a tip for that, is that I have my sewing corner in the living room, and I move the iron board to the television. So I try to watch a movie or a TV show while I interface just to make it a bit more bearable. um, and Howard also has some input on the fact that it's more and more common about using stretch in fabrics. He says, I won't make my pants unless the fabric has a bit stretch, even suiting, twills and denim. Yeah, comfort really is key now. I wonder if we'll ever get back to those rigid clothing, because when you think about it, you know, about, you know, still, well, it was basically in the 20s, so we're basically now at the almost 100 years ago when the liberation sort of started, when knit fabrics became underwear and the corsetry was sort of moved away and being replaced by the flapper style for menswear. Obviously the development was a bit slower. I think that for women clothing it became looser quicker, but then again, when you think about in the 50s, it sort of came back to that structured dressing with, you know, a lot of inner garments. So perhaps it does comes in waves, but I think that it will be really hard for designers to ever sell that idea upon us again. But I was really curious to see if we will ever go back to those rigid clothing, because it just doesn't feel modern at all. But definitely, obviously, fashion changes. So I think that's a fascinating subject to think about, that we have become so, you know, focused on comfort. So even though we like to have stylish clothes, it's so important now that they still have that give and a soft hand and doesn't require a lot of underpinnings and stiff interfacing, interlining and things like that. And Kyle, she has actually one of those press stations. I highly recommend having a press. It makes the process much faster. That should perhaps be my life goal as well. I'm definitely envious of you, Kyle. And Duncan says, I'm running out of space, Kyle, for a press. Yes, it's one more thing. And obviously, as I said, I'm in the living room with the iron board behind me. So perhaps I can find a little corner. I'm not living alone, I'm living with the family, so I don't really feel brave enough right now to expand my sewing space even more, because it still takes up a fair bit of a small apartment. And what I want to sort of address more in depth now, which I think is a topic that isn't talked about as much, and something that I do a lot, and I've also done a blog post about it, which I've linked to in the description section, and that is when and how to use fusible interfacing on knits. Now, you may ask, why do you need to use fusible on knits? Well, it all depends. Obviously, this top that I'm wearing right now, that has no fusible interfacing because it's a very simple top. But as soon as you add, say, perhaps a Peter Pan collar, you are maybe adding, perhaps you want to add a little bit of stability to the hem of garment that is made of knit. You perhaps want to add a button front, you know, like a polo shirt, or any type of buttonholes. Again, you should definitely familiarize yourself with using fusible interfacing. If not, there's actually, on the blog post I talk about, I cover all the different situations where you should or use fusible interfacing when you're sewing with knit. So I would basically say my rule of thumb is, as soon as you start adding some type of structure to a garment, to knit garment, then you need probably to consider fusible. Of course, obviously, it all depends on the fabric. Now, you will not hear me recommend using fusible interfacing to stabilize a part on perhaps activewear fabric like a super stretchy lycra knit. That is not what I'm talking about here. But if you're doing double knit, firmer jersey, all that sort of fabrics, that's really where fusible comes in place. And also, even if you are doing stretchy knits, as I said, if you're doing buttonholes, and perhaps also sometimes when you're attaching a zipper, you need to have a stable area, and so you can definitely use fusible even on that if it's just an area that shouldn't be stretched. Which brings me to, let me see if I have an example of this now. Well, I have so much stuff going on here, so I can't find it, but I will just talk about it, and perhaps I can, oh, here it is. As I said, the space is a little bit crowded, but I once made a leggings pattern that suggested that I used fusible interfacing for the waistband to stabilize it. Now, that felt to me absolutely counterintuitive, because if it's one thing that fusible, even if you use a knit fusible, once it's stretched out, you will get wrinkles on it. So you should not use that if the area should be stretched out. So fusible goes for area that needs stability, not the ones that needs to be stretched out. So of course I didn't use it. I used this instead, which you also can use as an interfacing, which is power net. You can also get power mesh, which is a bit thinner, but this is the perfect way to stabilize stretchy garments where you need areas but you don't want to fuse it. And I talk about this extensively in my book, Sewing Activewear, so you can check that out, and also talk more about how you should use fusible interfacing when you do buttonholes and eyelets and all those things when it happens in place. Anyways, I didn't use it for that pattern. I was a bit baffled by the recommendation, and I talked about it on one of my social channels. I don't remember which one. And someone who has also made that pattern chimed in and confirmed my suspicion that once she stretched out the leggings waistband with the fusible, it became wrinkly and it didn't look good. So use fusibles, but not for super stretchy areas. Perhaps there is some miracle fusible that will not behave like that, but I have not encountered that one as well, and I've tried lots of knit fusibles. So stick to mesh or net, like this lycra net instead. And also, by the way, talking about space here, we have some conversation going on in the chat where Mayra says that my press takes up less space than an ironing table does. You can then use an ironing pad on a table. And Kyle says, I bought an IKEA kitchen island and have my Elna press on the left side, a mini ironing board on the right side with my pressing ham, tailor board, etc. underneath. That sounds really good way of using it. And Monica says, hi Joe, kisses from a big fan from Lisbon, Portugal. Thank you so much. It's so nice to hear where you all guys from, because, you know, as I say, we have a very international crowd going on. That's why sewing is so great. It's definitely a very international hobby, so we can sort of meet up with this shared interest. And just a quick mention as well, which I should probably have prepared more, but I'm going to pull it out like this. Not technically interfacing, but also really good to use, is this type of fusible stabilizing band. This is the firm one, and this I use every time I need the neckline or something to prevent it from stretching. I use this, but the disadvantage of this one is not shapeable. So when I say neckline, I don't mean like super curved neckline, because that's obviously won't work, but it's great for the shoulder seam and if the neckline is V-shaped. And if you want to make it curved, you should definitely investigate the fusible, fusible bias cut interfacing tape that has a sort of stabilizing seam in the middle that keeps it from not stretching out too much, obviously, because when you cut fusible on the bias, it gets super stretchy. We have that here in Sweden from the Flisseline brand. It seems like it's not readily available internationally, which is a shame. I'm not sure if Pellon does it, for instance, but it's a wonderful thing to use. And you can also use it to stabilize necklines on knits. Again, a great way to use these fusible things. Anyways, if you have any more questions about interfacing, please tell me in the chat. I'd love to know, and I will do my best to answer them. And I will also give you a few updates about stuff. As some of you already know, I am working on a cover stitch book, which I am happy to say that I am 2/3. Is that correct, right? The fractions is a bit struggle for me. 2/3 is now done, and it's at my editor. She's checking out that the English language is in good shape, and I plan to publish the book in March of next year, so I'm going to give myself a lot of lead time to figure out a lot of the publishing things that goes around with this. It will again be available both as a print and as an ebook, and it will be sold as a paperback on Amazon primarily. I'm feeling really good about the book. I'm planning hopefully to do the last round of photo taking, which is the most exhausting thing about making a book, trust me, because everything I do is illustrate step by step. I will do that during my Christmas holiday leave, and so hopefully I will sort of have most things together in the beginning of next year, so I can stick to that set for myself March deadline of 2019 where the book will be published. So that I'm really excited about. It's been mostly fun apart from the photo session, and it's going to be a very extensive book covering all sorts of things with lots of step-by-step tutorials, lots of focus on troubleshooting, and obviously a lot of focus also on how to use cover stitch machines that goes beyond the sort of basic hemming with knits, which I think is why a lot of us buy a cover stitch machine in the first place. And a second update that I should mention is that if you're watching this live and want to get your hands on the ebook version of my Sewing Activewear book and also my patterns, which is I launched a pattern line about a month ago, including mittens and hat patterns like this. This is actually a recycled sweater, and I'm having a Black Friday sale, so if you check in the description section, there's a link to where you can get them, and I have 20% off, and the sales end at Monday at midnight Central European time, so you can check that out too if you haven't. And also I'm going to show you now my latest make, and I'm going to make a rush now and pick it up because I forgot to pick it. So we'll see if you can see this. I'm going to check the. Going to roll a bit back like this. Now this is my. Can you see me? So I made a workout top last night, which is part of my workout collection for winter wear. So this is the front, and I'm using mesh panels, and in the back it looks like this. So you can see it has a lot of air, and I'm really happy about it. The color looks a bit strong now on the camera because it can't color correct. It's not this strong in reality, but I was really happy about that. So I spent last night working on that one, and I drafted a pattern myself, and I'm going to make 3 more pieces of my activewear collection here. Probably do a fleece jacket next. I'm also drafting that pattern myself. And let me see if you have more comments. Yes. Let me see. I can see comment. I'm looking forward. How is this? I'm looking forward to your cover stitch book. Just purchase the brother machine and need all the help I can get. Well, I'm very happy to help. I have lots of tips to share. And Kyle says I'm also looking forward to your cover stitching book, Johanna. Thank you so much. And Mary says I'm working on mittens and a hat at the moment from scraps. They'll be lined to excellent, because that's one of the great things about when you're using patterns for like this for mittens. It's a great scrap buster as well, and you can use recycled sweaters, as I said. There are lots of ways, which is a good thing about, you know, sometimes we struggle, you know, what should we do with all the scraps? So one of those things is actually to make hats, and it's great for Christmas gifts as well, or holiday gifts, or any type of gifts that you want to make. And Monica has an interfacing question here. I need to learn with you. I buy animal print full fur, but it's thin, and I want a winter long coat. Can interfacing the fabric in all the sewing patterns to extrude my coat here? Let me see if I and Kristen says try Flisseline H609. Yeah, you should definitely use something that has a soft hand if you're doing that, but which brings me to fusible. Sometimes the glue dots will not stick on fabrics that is very fussy and has like ply, is that called ply surface? So you definitely need to consider making samples for that and make sure that it sticks. It depends. Sometimes on the wrong side there will be a backing, and that will hopefully be enough to make the fusible stick. So you definitely need to experiment with that. But I agree there that a soft fusible is probably the way to go there, because you don't want to change the hand of the fabric, and usually full furs are quite soft and supple. They shouldn't be like stiff and tailoring. So that's my 5 cents on that. I'm not 100% sure of it, to be honest. And also, speaking of which, I forgot to mention one thing as well when you're talking about fusible. I'm very focused on making garments because that's my specialty, but I know that a lot of you make bags. Kyle, by the way, which is Vacuuming the Lawn on Instagram. You need to check her out. She is a bag making maven. She does fantastic bags, and that is also where fusible interfacing can sometimes, correct me if I'm wrong, Kyle, but it could be beneficial. And so and also obviously interfacing that is not fusible but needs stability. So there are actually quite a few firmly fusible and non-fusible interfacing as well. This one I really like myself. I don't have the brand name, I can see it, but it has a really firm hand, and I use that every time I need like more stability than when I'm making regular garments. So if Kyle has some thoughts about which is great interfacing for bag making, I'd love to know, because that also can make a huge difference, I'm sure, for the end result there. What else? Let me see here. Yes, well, this is obviously, as I said, the last live stream of 2018. Yes, because we are going into the holiday season, at least here in Sweden. And I'm doing it last month of Sunday, which is like the day before New Year, I think. But I will be back with a live stream in January, and of course I will stick to my regular video publishing schedule each Sunday for the most part, unless there is again some holiday situation, then I probably post the video another day. But for the most part it's on Sunday, so that will not change. And Kyle has some suggestions here for how to what type of interfacing is great for bags. I love using Peltex for bags for stability, or 2 layers of it. So Peltex, that's a good. And Duncan says Decovil for bag making. I think that's the right spelling. And Kyle says Peltex comes in a few types. It's not fusible. Fusible on one side and fusible on both sides. And she says, well, thank you for your kind words. I love making bags, no fitting. That's a good point. And if you want some inspiration and up to how to up your bag game, Vacuum the Lawn is definitely an Instagram account to follow, because I am always amazed when I see her bags. They are absolutely amazing. And well, I think that's about it for me tonight. Sorry for the technical glitches there, but it seems that we got that sorted out, and hopefully I will figure some more things out until the next live stream. But I'm so happy that so many of you want to participate in this live stream. It just breezes by, and there's so much fun with the chat going on, and I love that you ask so much questions and keep the dialogue going, because that really energized me as well, and I learn lots of stuff as well. But now it's time for me to go to bed, because it's another week. It's Monday. Oh, not my favorite day, but you know that. Anyways, thank you so much for being here and watching the live stream. And as I said, if you want to check out my Black Friday, Cyber Monday sale, you can see a link there and check it out, how to get that 70% discount. It's a code. It's very simple. It's Black Friday 2018. That's the code. It works on my Etsy shop and my shop on my website. Okay, that was all for me. See you next time. Bye bye.